Fortress and the Fighter. The War of Attrition over Europe. The narrative of the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress is inextricably linked to the evolution of American military thought in the interwar years. The trauma of the First World War, a conflict defined by static, bloody trench warfare, led military theorists to search for a way to break the stalemate of future battlefields. Visionaries like Brigadier General William "Billy" Mitchell became ardent and often controversial proponents of air power. Mitchell's very public demonstrations, such as the sinking of the captured German battleship SMS Ostfriesland in 1921, were designed to prove that air forces could render navies and armies obsolete. He argued for an independent air arm, free from the control of ground commanders, whose purpose would be to strike directly at an enemy's vital centers. This philosophy coalesced into the doctrine of high-altitude daylight precision bombing. The United States Army Air Corps, USAAC, and later the Army Air Forces, USAAF, developed a fundamentally different approach from their British counterparts. The Royal Air Force, after suffering unsustainable losses in daylight raids early in the war, had shifted to nighttime area bombing. This tactic conceded precision in favor of survivability, aiming to saturate large urban areas with incendiary and high-explosive bombs to cripple industry and break civilian morale. The American approach was rooted in a profound faith in technology and a different ethical calculus. They believed that targeting specific, critical nodes of the enemy's war machine, factories, ball-bearing plants, fuel refineries, was not only more efficient, but also more morally justifiable than the indiscriminate bombing of civilian populations. The linchpin of this strategy was the Norden bomb site. This complex gyroscopically stabilized analog computer was a marvel of its time, shrouded in such secrecy that bombardiers swore an oath to protect it with their lives, even to the point of destroying it with a thermite charge if their aircraft was forced down. The propaganda machine hailed it as a device capable of placing a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. This tool, however, required a steady aircraft and, most importantly, a clear visual line of sight to the target, which irrevocably dictated daylight operations. This ambitious doctrine demanded an equally ambitious aircraft. The USAAC's 1934 specification for a multi-engine bomber to replace the Martin B-10 was the catalyst. Boeing, in a tremendous corporate gamble, invested its own funds to develop the Model 299. It was a bold departure from the twin-engine norm, a four-engine behemoth that promised unprecedented range and payload. Its public unveiling was a media event. A Seattle reporter, Richard Williams, struck by the array of machine gun blisters, dubbed it a 15-ton flying fortress in his caption. Boeing's marketing department, recognizing the immense power of the name, immediately trademarked Flying Fortress. The image was born, an impregnable aerial citadel. The Model 299's performance during trials was spectacular, outperforming its competitors by a significant margin. However, tragedy struck on October 30th, 1935. During a takeoff at Wright Field, the prototype, with Army test pilot Major Ployer Peter Hill at the controls, stalled, crashed, and burst into flames. The investigation revealed a simple, fatal human error. The crew had forgotten to disengage the control locks. The crash nearly doomed the project as it disqualified Boeing from the competition and reinforced the arguments of those who deemed the aircraft too complex and expensive. Yet, the potential demonstrated by the design was too great to ignore. Through a legal loophole and the persistent advocacy of forward-thinking officers, the USAAC ordered 13 YB-17S for service testing. This decision saved the program. The subsequent evaluation by the 2nd Bombardment Group at Langley Field, Virginia, was crucial. It was here that the foundational tactics for the new bomber were developed. Notably, the crash of the Model 299 led directly to the creation of the modern pre-flight checklist, a simple but profound innovation that would become standard procedure in all of aviation. The early B-17s, the B through D models, were lean and graceful compared to their later descendants. They were lightly armed, typically with 5 to 7 handheld machine guns in open positions that exposed crews to the bitter cold and thin air of high altitude. They lacked the powered turrets that would later define the fortress's silhouette, but they demonstrated two enduring qualities. They were remarkably stable bombing platforms, and they were built with a ruggedness that would become legendary. The aircraft structure, with its multiple wing spars and robust construction, could absorb a level of punishment that would destroy lesser aircraft. Even at this early stage, the legend of its toughness begs form. Part 2. The Crucible of Combat, Early Lessons and Hard Realities. The outbreak of World War II found the United States with a minuscule air arm. The doctrine of strategic bombing was just that, a theory largely untested in combat. The first true combat experience for the B-17 came not over Europe, but in the Pacific, and the results were sobering. On December 7, 1941, a flight of B-17s arrived at Pearl Harbor in the midst of the Japanese attack, having been en route to reinforce the Philippines. They were thrown into a desperate fight for which they were ill-prepared. In the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies, B-17s were used in attempts to halt the Japanese naval advance. They achieved little success against moving ships at sea. More critically, many were destroyed on the ground in devastating raids on their airfields, such as at Clark Field. The concept of the self-defending formation seemed to falter immediately against agile and determined Japanese fighter pilots like Saburo Sakai, who gained a respect for the B-17's ability to absorb damage even as he shot them down. These early failures were rationalized by the USAAF leadership. They were attributed to poor deployment, a lack of air superiority, and the unique challenges of the vast Pacific theater. The conviction remained that the true test would be in Europe, where the B-17 could be deployed in the mass formations for which it was designed. The vanguard of this effort, the 8th Air Force, began establishing itself in England in the spring of 1942 under the command of Major General Carl Spaatz. His chief of bomber operations, and later commander of the 8th, was Brigadier General Ira Eaker, a staunch and articulate defender of the daylight bombing doctrine. They faced profound skepticism from their British allies. The RAF, under Air Chief Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris, had learned through bitter experience that unescorted daylight bombers were prohibitively vulnerable. They had embraced the night, trading precision for survival. Harris and others believed the American insistence on daylight bombing was a tragic folly that would lead to the wholesale destruction of their bomber force. The initial missions of the 8th Air Force seemed to prove the Americans correct. The first B-17E raid on August 17, 1942, against the marshalling yards at Rouen-Sotteville in France, was a tactical success. 12 aircraft, led by Major Paul Tibbets and with General Eaker observing, bombed the target with minimal loss, protected by a strong Spitfire escort. Over the following months, as the 8th built its strength, it struck targets across occupied Western Europe. Losses were acceptable and confidence grew. The B-17E was a significant evolution from the early models. It featured a dramatic redesign. The fuselage was extended, and a much larger vertical stabilizer was added to correct directional stability issues. Most importantly, it introduced powered gun turrets. A manned Sperry ball turret was installed in the belly, and a dorsal turret was placed behind the cockpit. This increased defensive firepower from 7 guns to 9, and marked the beginning of the fortress's transformation into the bristling gunship of popular imagination. But this was the phony war of the air campaign. The Germans were studying these new tactics. As the 8th Air Force's ambitions grew, and it began probing beyond the coastal fringes of the German defensive network, it entered the kill zone of the Reichsluftverteidigung, Reich Air Defense. This was a sophisticated integrated system of early warning radar, ground-controlled interception stations, dense belts of radar-directed flak, anti-aircraft artillery, and highly experienced battle-hardened fighter wings. German fighter controllers became adept at massing their interceptors for coordinated assaults. The Luftwaffe pilots flying the excellent Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FGU-190 developed lethal new tactics tailored to exploit the B-17's weaknesses. They identified the forward arc as the bomber's most vulnerable point. This led to the development of the fearsome head-on attack. Formations of fighters would assemble ahead of the bomber stream, then turn in for a closing speed attack of over 500 miles per hour. They would fire their 20mm and 30mm cannons in a single devastating pass aimed at the cockpit and engines, then break away by diving beneath the formation. This tactic exposed the bomber's weakest defensive field for only seconds, but with catastrophic effect. The American counter was the refinement of the combat box formation. This was a complex three-dimensional stacking of bombers, typically 18 to 21 aircraft from a single bomb group, designed to create a cone of overlapping fire. The lead squadron flew at the highest altitude, with trailing squadrons staggered below and to the sides. This forced attacking fighters to fly through a gauntlet of .50 caliber machine gun fire from multiple directions. The discipline required was immense. Pilots had to hold a steady course during the bomb run, ignoring the flak bursts and attacking fighters, transforming their aircraft into stable but vulnerable platforms. It was a brutal test of collective courage and nerve. Part 3. The Crisis. The Death of the Unescorted Fortress. The year 1943 was the year of reckoning for the 8th Air Force. The Allied Combined Chiefs of Staff had issued the point-blank directive, aiming to achieve air superiority over Western Europe by systematically destroying the German fighter force. This meant striking the heart of the German aircraft industry deep inside the Reich. Targets like Regensburg, Wiener Neustadt, and the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. These targets lay far beyond the range of any available Allied fighter escort. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a formidable high-altitude fighter, but its radial engine was notoriously thirsty. Even with external fuel tanks, its combat radius only extended to the western borders of Germany. The P-38 Lightning had longer range, but was plagued by engine reliability issues in the cold European skies and was vulnerable in a turning fight. Once these little friends were forced to turn back, the big friends were left to face the full fury of the Luftwaffe alone for hours on end. The first Schweinfurt raid on August 17, 1943, was part of a deep penetration double strike that also targeted the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg. The plan was audacious. The Regensburg force, led by Colonel Curtis LeMay, would bomb its target and then continue south to land in North Africa, a bold maneuver to avoid the deadly return flight. The Schweinfurt force would return to England. The Germans were waiting. Both forces were savaged in running battles that lasted for hundreds of miles. The Regensburg force lost 24 bombers. The Schweinfurt force lost 36. 60 B-17s and their 600 crewmen were gone in a single day. It was a shocking loss, but the target was deemed so critical that a second raid was planned. That second raid on October 14, 1943, would become known simply as Black Thursday, a date etched in the memory of every 8th Air Force veteran. The mission was a straight-in, straight-out attack on Schweinfurt. The weather was poor and fighter escort was limited. As soon as the P-47s reached their limit and turned back, the German fighters swarmed the unescorted bomber stream. They attacked in relentless waves for over 3 hours. They employed new weapons, including the Werfer Granit 21, a large rocket mortar fired from outside the range of the bomber's guns to break up the tight formations. Then the cannon-armed BF-1, 09s and FW-190s moved in for the kill. The air battle was one of the most intense of the war. B-17s were seen to explode, break in half, and spiral down in flames. Parachutes dotted the sky, and some were tragically machine-gunned by German fighters, a violation of the chivalric code that had largely eroded by this point in the war. The carnage was absolute. Of the 291 B-17s that penetrated into Germany, 60 were shot down. 5 more crashed in England or were written off, and 12 were damaged beyond repair. A further 121 aircraft sustained major battle damage. The loss rate was over 26%. For the crews, the statistical probability of completing a 25-mission tour had become virtually nil. The psychological impact was devastating. A profound sense of crisis gripped the command. The unescorted deep penetration mission had been exposed as a catastrophic failure. The flying fortress alone was not a fortress at all. It was a death trap. In the aftermath, the daylight offensive was effectively suspended for deep penetration missions. The British felt their warnings had been tragically vindicated. There were serious debates in Washington about abandoning the doctrine entirely and merging the 8th Air Force into the RAF's night bombing campaign. The very existence of an independent American strategic air force was in jeopardy. The problem was starkly clear. The bomber would always get through only if it had a fighter that could go the distance. Part 4. The Savior, the Mustang, and a New Doctrine. The solution to the crisis had been in development for over a year. and it came in the form of a symbiotic relationship between a transformed aircraft and a revolutionary new tactic. The aircraft was the North American P-51 Mustang. Its origins were humble, a British commission for a low-altitude fighter. The early P-51A, with its American Allison engine, was competent but unexceptional at the high altitudes where the bomber war was fought. The transformation was engineered by the British. In a stroke of genius, they decided to make the Mustang's superb aerodynamically efficient airframe, featuring a laminar flow wing, with their own Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The result was the P-51B, and it was a revelation. The Packard-built Merlin engine gave the Mustang breathtaking performance. High speed, an exceptional rate of climb, and superb high-altitude handling. But its most critical attribute was its range. The aircraft's clean design meant it could carry large, streamlined external fuel tanks with minimal drag penalty. With a 75-gallon tank under each wing and a 110-gallon tank under the fuselage, the Mustang could fly to Berlin, engage in combat for 30 minutes, and return to England. For the first time, the bombers would have a guardian for the entire journey. The man who wielded this new weapon with aggressive brilliance was Lieutenant General Jimmy Doolittle, who replaced General Eaker in January 1944. Doolittle, a famed raider and a fighter pilot at heart, understood that passive defense was not enough. He issued a historic order to his fighter commanders. He rescinded the directive that fighters must remain close to the bombers. Instead, he commanded them to destroy the German Air Force. This was a fundamental philosophical shift. The fighters were unleashed. They were no longer merely shepherds, they were hunters. The P-51s were ordered to fly far ahead of the bomber streams, sweeping the airspace in front, attacking German fighters as they were forming up for their attacks, strafing them on their airfields, and forcing them into combat on American terms. This changed the entire dynamic of the air war. The Luftwaffe, accustomed to picking off unescorted bombers, now had to fight for its life against a determined superior enemy just to get to the target. The impact was felt almost immediately during Big Week, Operation Argument, in February 1944, a massive coordinated assault on the German aircraft industry. For the first time, the bombers were not alone over the deepest targets. Swarms of P-51s, along with longer-ranging P-47s, engaged the Luftwaffe in a series of immense aerial battles. The results were devastating for the Germans. Their experienced pilot corps, already a dwindling asset, was bled white. The loss rates for the 8th Air Force bombers plummeted from the double-digit percentages of 1943 to sustainable levels of 2 to 4%. A new confidence surged through the bomber crews. The sight of the silver Mustangs, with their distinctive dorsal fins, patrolling the skies became a powerful symbol of deliverance. The P-51 was not just a shield, it was a sword. A new generation of American aces emerged, pilots like Don Gentile, John Godfrey, and Francis Gabby Gabreski, who began racking up incredible scores. They achieved not just local air superiority, but air supremacy over the entire theater. By the time of the D-Day landings in June 1944, the Luftwaffe was a spent force, largely absent from the skies over Normandy. The German fighter arm was caught in a vicious cycle. Fuel shortages, caused by the very strategic bombing it was trying to stop, kept planes grounded, making them easy targets for strafing attacks, which further depleted their strength. The arrival of the revolutionary Me-2 jet fighter in late 1944 was a technological shock, but it was too late and too few to change the outcome, and it was often hunted by Mustangs as it took off or landed its most vulnerable moments. Part 5. The Fortress Fulfilled. The War of Attrition and the Legacy. With the Luftwaffe effectively neutralized by the long-range fighters, the B-17G, the ultimate embodiment of the flying fortress, could finally operate with the impunity its designers had once, perhaps naively, envisioned. The B-17G was the product of 3 years of brutal combat experience. Its most recognizable feature was the Bendix chin turret, housing 2.50 caliber machine guns, which provided a final, decisive answer to the deadly head-on attack. Its total armament was now 13.50 caliber machine guns, making it the most heavily armed bomber of the war. The crew of 10 became a finely tuned, if frozen, machine. Each man was a specialist, the pilot and co-pilot, the navigator guiding the formation across featureless skies, the bombardier who controlled the aircraft during the final bomb run, the flight engineer who monitored the engines and manned the top turret, the radio operator, the 2 waist gunners, braced in the biting wind of open windows, the ball turret gunner, curled in a fetal position in his plexiglass sphere beneath the aircraft, and the tail gunner, isolated in the rear of the plane, watching the formation recede behind him. The interior of the B-17 was a chaotic web of oxygen lines, electrical cables, ammunition tracks, and flak jackets, a world of roaring engines, sudden violence, and numbing cold, where temperatures could plummet to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. From the summer of 1944 until the collapse of Nazi Germany in May 1945, the B-17 and B-24 liberators of the 8th and 15th Air Forces pounded the Reich into submission. They executed the oil plan, systematically destroying Germany's synthetic fuel plants, which crippled the mobility of the Wehrmacht and grounded Luftwaffe. They shattered the transportation network, destroying marshalling yards, bridges, and canals, making it impossible for Germany to move men and materiel. They bombed armament factories and cities in a round-the-clock offensive with the RAF. The B-17 became the primary instrument of American strategic power. Of the roughly 1.5 million tons of bombs dropped on Nazi Germany and its occupied territories by Allied aircraft, over 640,000 tons, 42.6%, were dropped from the bomb bays of B-17 flying fortresses. The cost of this victory was astronomical. The 8th Air Force suffered more combat casualties than the entire United States Marine Corps in the war. A total of 26,000 8th Air Force personnel were killed, and another 28,000 became prisoners of war. Each of the 4,754 B-17s officially lost in combat represented 10 men and a personal story of tragedy, survival, or capture. The fame of the Memphis Belle, the first B-17 to complete a 25-mission tour, was so profound precisely because it was such a rare and hopeful event during the darkest days of 1943. The legacy of the B-17 is complex. It stands as a powerful testament to American industrial might. 12,731 aircraft were built, and to the courage and sacrifice of the young men who flew in them. It proved that strategic bombing could cripple an enemy's war-making capacity, but it also revealed the horrific human cost and moral ambiguities of total war. The initial American doctrine of high-altitude daylight precision bombing was proven to be fundamentally flawed. The B-17 was not the self-defending fortress of theory. Its ultimate success was not achieved alone. It was the result of a hard-won, bloody evolution in technology and tactics. The salvation of the bomber offensive and the validation of the strategic concept came from the symbiotic relationship with the long-range escort fighter. The P-51 Mustang did not just protect the B-17, it enabled it. It turned a vulnerable target into a decisive weapon. The story of the Flying Fortress is, therefore, not the story of a single aircraft, but the story of a system. The durable airframe, the courageous crews, the protective fighter umbrella, and the industrial base that sustained them. It is a definitive lesson that in modern warfare, no weapon, no matter how formidable, can operate in a vacuum. The fortress, to be effective, needed its guardians. The fortress, to be effective, needed its guardians. This hard-won victory, however, did not mark the end of the B-17 story. Even as the air war over Europe reached its crescendo in the final months of the conflict, the role and technology of the fortress continued to evolve. The utter devastation of German fuel production, a campaign executed with ruthless precision by these now protected bomber streams, had a cascading effect. The Luftwaffe was not merely beaten in the air, it was being starved on the ground. Pilot training was slashed to a fraction of its former duration, producing young, inexperienced flyers who were no match for the battle-hardened American fighter pilots and the veteran gunners aboard the B-17s. These new German pilots, often with only a handful of flight hours in their advanced fighters, were sent into a maelstrom of .50 caliber fire and prowling Mustangs. The qualitative advantage the Luftwaffe had once enjoyed was utterly erased, replaced by a desperate quantitative defense that could not sustain its losses. This was the ultimate success of the point-blank directive, achieved not just by shooting down German planes, but by systematically dismantling the entire ecosystem that supported them. The final evolution of the B-17, the G model, was a testament to this brutal learning curve. Beyond its famous Bendix chin turret, the G incorporated countless minor refinements born from combat experience. The window in the navigator's astrodome was thickened to resist flak splinters. The oxygen system was improved to reduce the ever-present threat of hypoxia at 25,000 feet. The electrical systems were hardened against the extreme cold that could render guns inoperable. Perhaps most tellingly, the waist gun positions, once open to the frigid slipstream, were eventually modified to be staggered and enclosed with plexiglass windows. A small mercy for the gunners who had endured the most exposed position on the aircraft. This was not the fortress of 1942. It was a veteran, scarred and improved by war. A machine refined by the blood of its predecessors. But the story of the B-17's contribution extends beyond the strategic bombing campaign that pounded Germany's cities and industries into rubble. Even as the war in Europe concluded, the airframe found new critical roles. Dozens of B-17s, redesignated as SB-17Gs or B-17Hs, were stripped of their armament and transformed into dedicated air-sea rescue aircraft, nicknamed Dumbos, operating over the vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean As the B-29 campaign against Japan intensified, these aircraft carried airborne lifeboats under their fuselages, which could be dropped by parachute to stranded bomber crews who had ditched in the sea. This mission of mercy, saving the lives of Americans in another theater, was a poignant postscript to the fortress's career as a weapon of destruction. Furthermore, the immediate post-war period saw the B-17 thrust into the dawn of a new technological age. Surplus aircraft were converted into drones, and drone directors for the burgeoning American missile program. They were flown through the mushroom clouds of atomic tests during Operation Crossroads to sample radioactive material, a task too hazardous for a manned aircraft without remote control. The very last official flight of a U.S. Air Force Fortress was not a bombing run, but a target mission in 1959, when a QB-17 drone was shot down by an air-to-air missile fired from a supersonic F-101 Voodoo. Its final duty was to usher in the era that would render it obsolete. The human legacy of the B-17 is etched not only in the casualty lists, but in the profound psychological impact on the men who flew them. They were a cross-section of America. These 10 men thrown together in an aluminum tube hurtling through a sky filled with fire and ice. The bond between pilot and co-pilot, the absolute trust placed in the navigator to find a speck of land in a featureless ocean, the reliance on every gunner to watch his sector. This was a unique form of camaraderie forged in the crucible of shared terror and responsibility. They faced not only the external threats of fighters and flak, but the internal, insidious dangers of mechanical failure, oxygen starvation, and the paralyzing cold that could freeze flesh to metal. The term shell shock from the trenches of the First World War found its aerial equivalent in what was then called combat fatigue, a mental exhaustion born from the relentless strain of missions where death was a random, impersonal event. The strategic bombing campaign itself remains one of the most debated legacies of the Second World War. While it unquestionably crippled German industrial capacity and diverted massive resources to air defense, the dream of precision bombing often collided with the reality of weather, enemy defenses, and the inherent limitations of 1940s technology. The smoke and industrial haze that blanketed German cities, the necessity of bombing through cloud cover using primitive radar sites, and the sheer scale of the effort meant that the campaign inevitably resulted in widespread destruction of civilian areas. The B-17, a symbol of American technical idealism, became an instrument of total war, raising enduring moral questions about the nature of conflict and the definition of a military target. In the final analysis, the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress stands as a monumental achievement. It was a machine that captured the public imagination and became a potent symbol of hope and retaliation in the dark early days of the war. Its rugged durability was not a myth. It brought countless crews home from missions that should have been fatal. But its legend often obscures the harsh truth of its early operational history. The unescorted Fortress was a vulnerable aircraft, and its crews paid a horrific price for a doctrinal flaw. Its ultimate triumph was a collective one. It was a triumph of American industry that could produce over 12,000 of these complex machines. It was a triumph of the engineers who refined the P-51 Mustang and the external fuel tank that gave it range. It was a triumph of tactical innovation, of leaders like Doolittle who had the vision to unleash their fighters. And above all, it was a triumph of the courage, sacrifice, and endurance of the young men who climbed into its fuselage, mission after mission, to see the war through from the frozen skies above Europe to the final, silent peace. The flying fortress was not a singular weapon, but the heart of a system, and its story is the story of how that system, through trial and terrible error, learned to fight and ultimately learned to win.